Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and our Friday show, then a break for 2 days, then we start again on Monday. So, over the last 3.5 years on the channel, we've looked at the D-Day airborne drops, we've looked at the work of the SOE and the OSS, but not the subject of today's show. My special guest, Benjamin F. Jones, has far too many qualifications to list in this introduction, but he's the author of this book, which I'm holding up now, Eisenhower's Guerrillas. The links to purchase the book, you all know the score, are in the description below, or you can find it at your favorite bookstore in person or online. But I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Ben. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm very well. So the unit we're going to be talking about, it should be a big integral part of the D-Day story, but I don't know that it always is part of the D-Day story. So before we get into your presentation, how did you come across it? How did it arrive on your doorstep, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was formerly in the Air Force and stationed at RAF Mildenhall. And as I was leaving that unit in the mid-90s, an officer who had served in that unit and was going to back visiting, he said, I told him I was going to go off to grad school, and I was thinking I would do a master's thesis probably on a Civil War topic. And he said, hey, all those stuff in World War II, it doesn't get a lot of attention that SOF did. And you should look into that. And so I kind of tucked that away. And then when I was walking down the stacks of books in the University of Nebraska library, I came across published volumes of secret message material and other things from the OSS documents. And I pulled one off the shelf, and I was looking through that. And then I thought of what my former commander had told me. And I said, hey, wait a minute here. Maybe there's something here, and I can do the primary sources right from Nebraska. And there were a couple of retired Jedburghs living in the area. And so my thesis advisor said, well, great, if you can get some oral interviews and you've got these primary sources and there's not a ton done on them. And so that's kind of how it started, was that colonel putting that idea in my head, and having just served in a unit for 3 years that did special operations work in the mid-90s in Europe and Africa. I was pretty familiar with kind of how it ran and the things I found. For instance, at the time we had a 96-hour planning cycle to get special forces onto a target from the time a request was sent by higher headquarters. We need somebody dropped on this target, and that 96-hour planning cycle was determined by these guys in the Second World War. So. When I came across that in the Eisenhower Library, I thought, wow, I thought we were doing better than they did in World War II, but some things still take the same time and path. So yeah, and there's the cover of the book.
Yeah, and it's a great start, because one of the things that often comes up, we've covered Operation Torch and we've covered the Salerno landings, the Anzio landings, is that a crazy amount of prep went into Operation Overlord, for 2 years before. Some of the other landings were a little bit kind of written on the back of a cigarette packet in a pub, a week before they went in, kind of thing. Whereas Overlord is just built on months and months of what I always call kind of making sure, force multiplying, making sure it doesn't fail, making sure that you get that tactical surprise, and you've done everything you possibly can to maximize the chance of the Allies getting that foothold, and the delaying the response to the Germans, which I guess is kind of the way we're going into. But I'm going to hand over to you to kind of take us through the presentation. Folks, you know the score. Jump in with questions pertaining to what we're talking about as we go along, and then if any kind of broader questions about the concept of special forces or what Ben's work is, we'll kind of do them later on. But I'm going to hand over to Ben now to take us through this, and just tell me when to nudge on the slides. And over to you, Mr. Jones.
Yeah, well, if you can go ahead to the next slide there. So when you start off a historical project, you start asking questions, and these were the guiding questions that I had in the work. Is what did the overall thing, what impact on the war in Europe did the Jedburghs have? There was an awful lot of secrecy during and in the decades following, because it was classified, but Jedburghs or Jedburghs were in some cases out there talking about what they'd done. And so there was some stuff even in the 40s, but a little bit in the 70s. Some guys wrote some books in the United States and in Britain. But they had their own a very tactical level understanding of their role and what they did. And from my perspective, I wanted to know, did it make a difference in the war? Did they help win the war? That was essentially what I wanted to know. So then from that comes some of these questions. You know, what does Eisenhower expect from the Free French? It's very important to, if you're going to invade France, to have the support of the French. Otherwise, you know, politically, what's the point? And operationally, it's going to put a lot of walls up in front of you, literally. What do the Germans think was happening to them? You know, to some degree, they would be the arbiters of deciding whether the Jedburghs had an impact or not, whether the Jedburghs were helping to win the war, or whether they were just sources of information, because a lot of these spies are going to get picked up and get questioned and be sources of information. And so what did the Germans think was happening to them? And I found out some interesting things about what the Germans thought was going on in the German military archives in Freiburg. And then this kind of set of what were the Jedburghs successful? Did they positively impact Eisenhower's campaign? Why did the Jedburghs deploy so late? This was among the folks from the United States, Britain, and France that had studied the Jedburghs immediately following the war. There's a lot of anger about the misuse of them, that they were sent in too late. And so that was kind of a question among the folks who were kind of in the know within the CIA and the special forces and the army and so forth. Is what caused that? So I answered that in the book. Why is airlift and communication such a mess? I talk about that, and I'll get into that. And then what can we learn about why some teams succeeded? Some teams did fabulously well, and others, it was a complete waste of time, and they knew so at the time. So it's a wide variety of experiences, all to get to the impact. And then after the war, some of these guys go on to become pretty influential. Bill Colby is a Jedburgh. He later directs the CIA. General Singlaub is a Jedburgh. He later is in command of maquis in Vietnam. Bernard Knox becomes a scholar and influential in his own way as a classical scholar in the Washington area. Within France, many of them are key players in the persistent guerrilla wars in the early Cold War. And in Britain, they all have their role to play too in the Cold War Army. When thinking about left behind teams, stay behind teams in the Cold War is something that the CIA is doing. So I get into a little bit of that at the end of the book.
Okay. And we've had the questions predictably about the pronunciation. They've already come in there. So let's clear it up. So Barry Milgate is saying, was wondering, is it Berg or Bruh or both? And Willie, who's a regular, grew up 10 miles away from it is Jedburgh. That's where it started off. But as I was talking to Ben before going live, it is now a word that's been adopted within the American military community. And so it's now Jedburgh in terms of how it's talked about within the USA. But originally it was Jedburgh. Is that kind of, are we all happy with that, folks? Are you happy with that?
Yeah, I respect I've been to Jedburgh, and it's an amazing town, and I appreciate the structure there, the ruins that were there. So in fact, I was there before I wrote any of this. So when this came up as a topic, I thought, well, how did they get their name? And it was plucked from a series of code names that were available to Special Forces headquarters to use. They picked that for some reason. This is what we think. Nobody's really sure. There's a lot of legend that the teams were named after Jedburgh because of what was known as one of your viewers might recall, Jedburgh justice, which was kind of a violent way of doing business amongst enemies. That we'll get into some of that here, and so that became kind of a bit of legend. But I think the plausible answer is it was just picked randomly off a series of code names. So the proper pronunciation is Jedburgh, but sometimes we Americans put our own spin on things.
That's perfectly understood. And we're getting lots of questions about, so is this OSS? Is this SOE? Are they military? Are they paratroopers? Well, we're going to clear all that up there. Kind of the answer is yes, 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 I suppose, isn't it really? And also no.
Yeah. Well, and here, this org chart kind of gets into that. So I think it's important to note that Jedburgh operation was a British idea. the Brits knew they needed the Americans for airlift, manpower, supplies, and so forth. And so they reach out to the OSS to get OSS involved. General Donovan, who's the director of the OSS in Washington, is very eager to do things like this. This is right up his alley. This is just the thing he wants to do. And so he agrees to do it. And then that red question mark there in the middle is kind of the problem set that Eisenhower has to deal with, that I go into great detail in the first 40, 50% of the book, is explaining Eisenhower's political problems in linking up with the French. And he realizes he needs a French commander in order to do that. And he can't name the French commander. The French resistance has to do that. And so that'll be coming up in the next slide. But all these people here, you probably familiar faces at the top, certainly Churchill, Roosevelt, Donovan, to your audience, probably familiar.
Yep.
I imagine many people are familiar with Colin Gubbins. I go into his background quite a bit because he is carrying what the British understand how to conduct guerrilla warfare and insurgency prior to World War II. He's kind of he and maybe 5, 6 other guys within the British Army have experience around the world to some degree, but particularly in Ireland. And they write about, I guess today we would call it doctrine. He writes about insurgency, guerrilla warfare, counterinsurgency, and so forth. And so he's kind of a natural to become the person who Churchill and SOE ultimately tapped to manage SOE's commando capacity, commando division. And then the gentleman beneath him on the British side there, Brigadier Eric E. Mockler-Ferryman, is the co-director of what becomes Special Force Headquarters, which is stood up in March of 44. So 80 years ago this month. It would have been a couple weeks old. Mockler-Ferryman had been the chief of intel for Torch in North Africa. When things go south there, Eisenhower needs to fire somebody, and he decides he's got to fire Fredendall, but it's an Allied operation, so he's got to fire a Brit too, and Mockler-Ferryman becomes the guy that gets reassigned. So Mockler-Ferryman goes back to Britain. Gubbins picks him up to become his director for SHAEF, for the British Special Operations Executive that would be tied into the Overlord planning, and for European operations. And Mockler-Ferryman, I think, does a spectacular job, and probably was doing a spectacular job in North Africa too, but just politics, he got the short end of the stick there. Ultimately, even though he's 2 or 3 people down on the chain, when Eisenhower comes to England to oversee SHAEF operations, I didn't find anything that Eisenhower was concerned about Mockler-Ferryman running this plan. So I think it was pure, his relief in North Africa was purely, political and Allied politics. So the gentleman on the right there, the American Colonel Joseph Haskell, is a West Point graduate, cavalry officer, career Army, and in World War II, he's tied into New York politics. His dad had been the commander of the New York National Guard and had been buddies with Donovan. And I sat in his daughter's New York apartment in the 90s, and she said, well, I've always wondered if this stuff I've been keeping in my closet would be of any use to anybody. And she rolled out his files, maps. I was amazed at what she had held on to. So I got to know Colonel Haskell's daughter a little bit, and was happy to kind of hear her stories about his activities after the war, which he may have been in the CIA. It wasn't real clear to her, but she thought that he was kind of running operations from time to time while he was in a New York import-export firm in New York City. But Haskell's a very shrewd guy, speaks French well, and can get along with folks. And so this is the kind of the organizational team thinking about how to do unconventional war in France and in the SHAEF theater more widely. And it's important to know that that red question mark there underneath Eisenhower is really key, because you think about Eisenhower for the invasion has a land forces component commander. He has a sea forces component commander. He has an air component commander. Today, the British, the Americans, the Australians, everybody has all of those, and they have a special forces component commander. And Eisenhower is needing that. He forms Special Forces headquarters with these two co-directors, because I think there's a hesitancy of placing your nation's special operations forces under the command of a foreign officer, which is one of the things that really is the most remarkable thing about the Jedburghs, is that they are allied from the tactical level to the strategic until you get to the elected office officials, such as the president or the prime minister. They're allied all the way up the chain. And why that occurs is because of allied politics, and it goes away because allied politics changes after the war. So that's important to keep in mind as we go through this. So next slide, I think. Yeah, and the key figure here is Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle, as World War II starts, as many of your audience knows, was the most junior general in the French army. He had advocated for armored warfare and tanks in the interwar period. Had kind of been told that wasn't the way France was going to go. They were going to go with the defensive strategy and operational level doctrines. And so he was kind of on the outs, but as the war starts, he's the only one who in France knows anything about tank warfare. The president of France makes him a minister, an assistant minister for war, which kind of, he wants him to, you need to help us. In May of 40, he gets pulled into the cabinet and directed to sort out man training and equipping a tank, a growing tank element for the French army. He leaves France on the 16th of June to go to Britain to buy tanks and arrange for that to happen, and his government falls. By the time he lands in Britain, the government is done, and so he works to get on a BBC microphone and gets kind of tacit approval from Churchill to grab some airwaves and some airtime, and makes a very famous call that probably at the time very few people actually heard, but it becomes kind of known that he is hoping to establish a French unit that will join the British in the invasion of France at some point in the future. At that point, he has no political ambitions, but as time goes, and just to make a very long story short, as time goes on, by 42, 43, it's very clear to most people who are watching French politics at the time that de Gaulle has the only person with credibility to lead a united France after the war is going to be Charles de Gaulle, because he was never a collaborationist, and politically, that's everything to the typical Frenchman. By the time of May, June, July 44, that's everything, and to any resistance movement that gets going by late 42 and into 43, having a leader who was never a collaborationist is key, and de Gaulle is really the only person who fits that job qualification. Next slide. So here's the first conversation between Roosevelt. He'd never met de Gaulle until this is a fairly well-known photograph taken at the Casablanca conference. Churchill kind of arranges for this meeting, and Roosevelt and Churchill agree. They aspire to get the French kind of on the same page. Roosevelt hopes that General Girard, who is the gentleman on the left there, who is one of the more senior French generals, a 4-star general, had been captured by the Germans, escaped, has a scar on his face from a bullet that nearly killed him. Really has quite a story to tell about that, and a pretty solid reputation. But among the resistance by this time, there's a lot of thinking that de Gaulle is going to be it. But Roosevelt doesn't want it, because Roosevelt likes Girard, and he likes Girard because Girard will do what he tells him. So for Roosevelt and Churchill, it's kind of a key feature. And But it's at this meeting where de Gaulle rolls out a kind of a line of argument to Roosevelt that he had shared with the American ambassador, Admiral Stark in London, which is why Stark supported the meeting. Stark was very impressed with him. And that line of argument is that France has often been divided amongst itself. It's often faced tragedy and calamity, but there's always been somebody to rise to the occasion. And he gives the example of Joan of Arc. Stark's, either his translation was better or he understood a little French himself, so he takes that in the spirit in which it's meant. When de Gaulle shares that same story with Roosevelt, the translation gets garbled. Roosevelt doesn't understand the way it's meant and thinks that de Gaulle is thinking that he is himself the Joan of Arc. So he repeats that story the rest of his life, that de Gaulle is this arrogant general who thinks he's Joan of Arc and really kind of sloughs him off as a nobody. And this is a problem because for the rest of the book, that political problem or that political disagreement, misunderstanding is what's going to cause the Jedburghs to have a tremendous amount of difficulty when they get into France, because there hasn't been well thought out, well planned. Unlike almost every other aspect of Overlord, this is a key piece, and it's all done on the fly.
And just to say, folks, we have a show on May the 1st with James Conroy about this Casablanca meeting of Eisenhower, Churchill, and de Gaulle, and FDR. So looking forward to that one, to go into the detail of how what was said and the ramifications, not just for special forces, but for the entire invasion of France and the Second Front. So that's coming up next week.
Yeah, good. It's a key conference, and it lays the groundwork for a lot. I think you can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, speaking of the resistance, so I took this from John Sweets's book, The Politics of the Resistance in France. He spent a considerable amount of time in France trying to comb together all the different resistance groups that organically established themselves, starting from late 1940. Most of them began kind of in the summer, late 1942, as the Germans try to draft labor to go into Germany and work in factories. That just floods the resistance by late 42. Plus the invasion of North Africa also is a great way to draft resistance, young men in particular, but also women. And these organizations start to kind of pool and coalesce and form themselves. And then there's tons of negotiation internally and externally. And it's tough to keep up. But the point of this slide is that you can get kind of buried in all of the alphabet soup here in the French acronyms. But I think the point is that by certainly by late 43, early 44, everybody, the communists, everybody says de Gaulle is the leader of the French resistance. And that just becomes a political reality that the French realize. Vichy doesn't realize that, but anybody in the resistance realizes it. A lot of the State Department, the American Secretary of State realizes it. Churchill, I think he understands that. That's the reality. Eisenhower, by January, February of 44, he understands that that's the reality. In fact, before he leaves the Mediterranean theater in around Christmas of 43, he and de Gaulle have a chance for a quick conversation, and they both leave that meeting kind of understanding one another. And I think Eisenhower then goes to London realizing that he's got to work with the French, and that means working with de Gaulle. Next slide. So the French also have an intelligence and special operations capacity that they're building alongside the SOE. But in their quite understandable desire to exercise their own sovereignty over their own country, they are sending in agents to basically be governors over the various regions or provinces of France. So they parachute these guys in with SOE support, sometimes OSS American support, but generally on SOE aircraft, parachute them in. And these gentlemen have the command of, there's kind of a simulated lieutenant colonel in the Army, but they're given political orders. They say, go to this province, set up an underground government, and when the orders come, you'll be the guy in charge. And of course, don't get arrested and all that kind of stuff. Stay a step ahead of the Nazis. So the gentleman that tries to organize all this from London is the one on the top left there, Colonel Andre de Wavrin, or also known as Passy is his code name. He becomes de Gaulle's chief of intelligence and operations. They essentially merge those two things. And Passy is the one person attempting to orchestrate those two efforts, gathering intelligence, but also the political aspect of setting up an underground government. And then Chaban Damas is a national military delegate, parachutes in. Borges Monnery, aka Polygon, is a Southern Zone military delegate. And then is kind of in the pecking order within France, down to the provincial level, is this gentleman, Eugene Deschalette. I came across his code name and his name before I saw his photograph. And I had in my mind, because this guy winds up becoming, I think, the most successful, outside of Paris, the most successful local French resistance leader in France. And just look at him, the bespectacled there, nerdy looking guy whose family runs a textile mill in southwestern France before the war. And he winds up, he parachutes in. I think he breaks his ankle on the landing. And his first message back to London is, I've arrived, broken ankle, send more 38 ammo. So in other words, he's like, yeah, I'm going to get on the mend here, but I'm going to need more ammo than you sent me. And he spends several weeks and months prior to the Jedburghs coming in. There'll be teams that go into his region, setting up the networks. They got to decide where they're going to hide ammo, where they're going to stash cash, where they're going to stash gasoline, all these kinds of things. When the push comes, they're going to go. And this is that kind of carpet upon which the Jedburghs will arrive.
And a quick question for you, Ben.
Yeah.
We all know that by 1944, France, like many of the occupied countries, has had SOE and OSS agents for some time, but the resistance networks, the escape lines, they're being broken. There are double agents. The Gestapo are stopping these routes as fast as they're being established. How Eisenhower needs to get this program off the ground, but clearly there's this big problem with who you can trust in France because of the danger of everything getting back to the Germans. So how do they manage that idea, that concept?
Well, their spies and operatives are constantly being arrested. Borges Monnery goes in to become a regional delegate, but he winds up being promoted because the national guy's arrested and hauled off to Ravensbrück or some camp. May 1st of 1944. It's a particularly black day for the resistance, particularly in Brittany. Their entire organizational apparatus is arrested. And then the national Borges Monnery's predecessors arrested. He was a uniformed one-star general, and off he goes to Germany in a prisoner train. So it's constant, and they have to come up on the net securely, radio traffic, so-and-so arrested, awaiting orders, and then they would get a message that says, okay, you're the boss, or prepare for somebody else to be parachuted in. It's just a constant challenge, constant worry.
Yeah.
Good question.
Next slide.
Yes. So that red question mark that was in the previous slide is ultimately filled by this gentleman, Pierre Koenig, is a French general. He starts out the war as a major. He's combat commander's combat commander. He is the first commander in the French army in World War II to secure even a modest victory against the German forces. And that happens in North Africa. The battle becomes, as I would read resistance newspapers, there were newspapers named after that battle. And he was the commander of the battle. And I'm blanking on the name of the engagement, but it's in North Africa, and it was a part of the drive that Rommel was doing to get to Egypt or get to Cairo.
Bir Hakeim?
Bir Hakeim, yes. There's a couple of resistance groups in France that then name themselves Bir Hakeim. So it kind of becomes a rallying cry that, hey, you know, it's a confidence builder. And so he establishes a lot of credibility as being an effective commander against the Germans. De Gaulle brings him to England, promotes him to 3 stars, and says, okay, you, now that we've had the 1 star that was in France, was arrested, you're going to be the ultimate commander of the Free French Forces of the Interior. There was some talk about him parachuting in, but I think the need De Gaulle realized, and Eisenhower kept asking De Gaulle, or probably more appropriately, Eisenhower's chief of staff kept asking De Gaulle, because Eisenhower didn't want to do it. I don't think wanted to do that directly, because he didn't have authority to do that from Roosevelt yet, to work with Roosevelt's or work with De Gaulle's people. So De Gaulle names Koenig as the gentleman for the commander of the Free French Forces, and Eisenhower is glad to put him in on staff, rename Special Force Headquarters, which would have command of Special Forces operations under Schaeff's area of operations, which would be Western Europe. But Koenig is limited to Eisenhower's Special Operations Forces in France, only in France. So if there's Dutch special operations that go on, the SOE, maybe the OSS, the Dutch would run that underneath SFHQ. No other nation is as persnickety about their sovereignty as France. And I think there might be some questions about that toward the end we can get into, but I think this is a success that De Gaulle comes out of the war really looking in great stead. And Pierre Koenig then, as I said, is accepted as the commander of the Free French Forces of the Interior, and also dual-hatted commander of the OSS SOE French Special Forces in France. Next slide.
Okay.
And of course, they can't tell him where the landing beaches are going to be. They can't tell Koenig where his special forces are going to go in France. So in the middle of May, I think it's about May 18th or so of 1944, they have a meeting in Finchampstead in England where they get all the SF crowd together, the special forces planners, Haskell and Mockler-Ferryman. Koenig is there, and they ask General Koenig, you know, what would be your priorities of where we should send Jedburgh teams, where we should send supplies, ammo, gasoline, cash, this kind of stuff. And he kind of lays it out, and I'm pretty certain that those numbers are Koenig's desires, expressed desires on what his priorities are as of the middle of May of 44. Of course, he doesn't know when the invasion is going to be. He doesn't know if it's going to be Normandy. He doesn't know Western France, Brittany. He doesn't know any of that. So the French planning staff has come up with 6 different versions of how this is going to go based on the location of the Allied invasion. And so they've got, you know, many of your viewers may have heard of the war plan, or the Rainbow series that the United States does in preparation for what becomes World War II. They've got all that kind of sorted out, but ready to shift based on the location of the invasion beach. So they know which, they've got opinions on which railway lines to blow, which power lines to blow, which roads and bridges need knocked out based on where the Germans are, where they think the Germans are, and what they will need for their war effort after the invasion and so forth. And so this is the first time then, in the middle of May of 44, when the French resistance, who've got all these plans together, but they don't know the invasion beach, and the Allies, who know the invasion beach, got tons of planning down to the nth detail how many bullets are going to need and all this kind of stuff, meals and time of day and lunar implications and all the deception plan and radio traffic and all this stuff ready to go. And they have to, because the key thing here is you have to tell those agents, the British agents, the French agents, the American agents that are in France, you have to tell them what code to expect when the euphemistic balloon goes up, right?
Yep.
Jacques has a long mustache. You look at the Longest Day movie, right? That's the code for that guy in that movie. Jacques has a long mustache. You have to tell all those guys their particular code. And they might have 4 or 5 codes telling them to do different things. So if he hears Jacques has a long mustache, they say, oh, well, I go down 5 miles and I blow that bridge. If it's something else, I go 2 miles that way and blow the telegraph lines. So if you're in the French resistance and you can't be spoken to, you're constantly waiting for, are you going to tell me? Are you going to tell me? Are you going to tell me? And of course, this becomes a snafu in many cases. And also on that map is helpfully drawn the range of aircraft from Britain. So that mark down there at the bottom of the map, it's got some French writing on there. The reactions of the night flights, but that AFHQ is in Algiers, Allied Forces Headquarters. They have a special operational command, SPOC, which is one of the cooler acronyms you'll run across. And they are also attempting to stay in the loop with operations in France, which is technically out of their theater, but yet they've got Jedburghs that come down to Algiers in order to deploy them to southern France, which is beyond the range of aircraft in England.
We got a question from Terry about the Allied reluctance to trust French security, a factor in keeping Koenig out of the specifics of invasion planning, because as you're saying what you're saying, I'm thinking of this, it's basically a risk-reward challenge, isn't it? The potential rewards of getting a network set up that will hinder German movement, et cetera, is huge. But the risks of giving anybody involved in this information that could then be picked up by the enemy is that the only way Overlord is going to work is with complete tactical surprise. So this is a real, it's a microcosm of the greater problem of the deception campaign of Pas-de-Calais and Normandy. But this is on a smaller scale of trying to gain an advantage, but not give the Germans an advantage as well.
Exactly. Well put. That's the balance that Eisenhower's got to do. But I think he comes out on the side. Well, the thing that really tipped me off to the fact that this was front and center in Eisenhower's mind is when I was doing research in the Eisenhower Library, I came across his last message before D-Day. He sends it to General Marshall in Washington, who's his boss. And it's a long message. It takes up more than a page of that old telegraph style paper, where he basically spends about a sentence or two saying he's ready to go. The invasion's ready to go. But then he takes 2 paragraphs and he's begging General Marshall to talk to the president to resolve this situation about de Gaulle. He's begging him, please. I mean, it's polite, bureaucratic army language from a junior officer to a more senior officer. But he's dripping. I mean, I read that and I thought, what is going on here? That de Gaulle must just be a jerk. Well, no, Roosevelt's being the jerk. And it took me a long time to realize that Eisenhower is saying de Gaulle is not the problem. De Gaulle is the solution. OPSEC being what it is, we need to be mindful of security of our information. However, we can't invade France without the French, which is what Churchill wires Roosevelt on like May 30th. He says that in one of his pithiest phrases, it's going to be hard to invade France without the French. And that transmission to Roosevelt goes unanswered. So Churchill then knows this is a problem, and he will invite de Gaulle up to London, send a plane down to Algiers to go get him, and bring him up to London. And I think the next slide is that photograph. If I'm not
mistaken. We got this first.
Oh, no. So, of course, this is a wire diagram of the German organizational effort, and I just threw that in there. I found this on a microfilm in the German military archives, and often left off of many organizational charts about the German army of France is the Feldgendarmerie, the kind of local German security police. These are the guys in charge of keeping the population under control, and they will be the lead counterinsurgents for the German army during the spring and summer of 44 and fall of 44 is the Feldgendarmerie. And they're under the direct command of von Rundstedt there, and they will do some counterinsurgency operations, which a gentleman by the name of, well, the book's in German, but he used to teach in England, I think. I don't know if he's still teaching in England. Loeb is his name. It's an excellent book on German counterinsurgent warfare that he wrote. Maybe it's translated by now, I'm not sure, but he goes into the details of how the Germans tried to meet the challenge of the insurgency in the spring and summer of 44.
Okay.
So next slide. Yes, and so this is the photo. This is the photograph taken for the newspapers, but sequestered until after the invasion was launched. De Gaulle is invited, and on his way to meet Eisenhower, he rides in a train car with Churchill. They discuss a wide variety of things, but Churchill tips him off. He says, "I'm taking you to General Eisenhower's headquarters. We're going to show you the plan. Eisenhower will answer all your questions, and then we have some requests of you." The request he wants to make is that Eisenhower has been asked by Roosevelt and Churchill to get all of the occupied nations' government in exiles to make radio broadcasts to their populations about Overlord. And so he wants de Gaulle to do the broadcast. That's the only thing he really wants from de Gaulle at the meeting, but he's happy to kind of show him around. And this is when he finds out Koenig is with him at this meeting. This is when he finds out the when and the where. And it's 24 hours to go. De Gaulle takes the speech that Eisenhower's staff has written up, and he kind of hands it to Koenig, and he says, "Yeah, we're going to change that." He's not going to be the mouthpiece for the Allies. That's basically what he's asserting. Koenig kind of gives Eisenhower a nod, like, "Yeah, we'll fix it, and we'll get the man on the radio." Koenig is very much a team player. General Koenig is, and he wants to. He works for Eisenhower in the Allied structure, so he kind of is sorting out a way for the French to officially fit within the Allied structure. And so he knows this is kind of a big task that he gets de Gaulle on the radio saying things are permitted. On the train car, interestingly, they have a fight about currency. Early in the war, the British start printing French francs. This just sends de Gaulle through the roof. You know, a foreign nation doesn't have the right to print the currency of another nation. And so that comes up during this train ride, and de Gaulle goes through the roof. Something else, I mean, there's just kind of one barb after another between Churchill and de Gaulle. So when de Gaulle gets off the train, he's not happy. And Eisenhower gets to deal with this grumpy Frenchman, who he needs. He needs him, right? So he shows him the map. He takes him around the staff headquarters, which is now in a tent, as Eisenhower is kind of getting ready to launch the invasion. And de Gaulle's very impressed. He's always been impressed with Eisenhower. They've had very good, productive conversations. And de Gaulle tells Eisenhower, "You've thought of everything." You know, he looks at the complexity of the plan. He's thought of everything. So this is impressive. And then that's when Eisenhower hands him the text for the radio broadcast, and de Gaulle kind of sniffs and hands it to Koenig. Then he goes on the air, and a few hours after most of the others. But it's not until this moment that they get the when and the where.
It's amazing how late they left that. I mean,
Yeah.
that as you said, that rallying cry to the French to tell them what to do and what not to do, you know, you'd have thought they'd have got that done and dusted and recorded, and the text worked out weeks ahead. And it's all last minute. It's amazing, and it's also with the politics, as you're so deftly explaining, which is really brilliant. We're hanging off every word.
Okay. Next slide. So who are the Jedburghs? Well, this is a typical team here. as I said, the British come up with the idea. They exercise it. They role play it in 42. They realize we can't just have a college-educated French speaker. We need a native French speaker. And we need the American capacity of logistics and soldiers. And so that changes the nature of what they're doing when you ask and when you make it an Allied operation. And they could not have foreseen all the complexities of French politics at the highest level. De Gaulle was asked about this in January, February, and they do a recruiting campaign. The BCRA does, the French intelligence and the army folks do, that go to North Africa to try to recruit French officers. They never get enough, but they have the highest number required because there's got to be a Frenchman on every team. So they try to stand up 100 teams. And even into May, they're still looking for French officers to join the effort. The United States, the OSS, as I said, Donovan wants to get in this game. It becomes a challenge in recruiting French-speaking or French conversant officers who are parachute qualified and radio men who are parachute qualified. That's, you think about 8 million man or 9 million man American army, American military establishment by early 44. But then when you shrink down, you got to be parachute rated, you got to know some French, and you got to be willing. This is a volunteer deal. You got to be willing to jump in behind the lines. And so they recruit Master Sergeant Robert Kehoe. He was, I think, the second to last living American Jedburgh. I met and interviewed him for the book, and I saw him in 2016. He was living in a senior living home in Colorado, enjoying his last of his years there. Just an incredible guy. He goes off to, after the war's over in Europe, he goes to China, and then he becomes a State Department kind of China hand after the war. Major Adrian Wise there, he's one of the stellar British officers in the Jedburgh operation, and really one of the stars from the British perspective and the Allied perspective. But that's kind of a typical, it's a rare shot. And I think this shot was taken in a studio in London, in a safe house, probably in May of 44.
And it's good, American M43 jacket, British battle dress, French wings. It's that it shows you the dynamism of this unit, the makeup of different nations coming together. It's a hybrid. It's a loose. It's both military and sort of and not sort of civilian as such, but military, but kind of political. It's complicated. I love the Jets are a fantastic story.
Yeah.
All right, moving on.
Yeah. So if you think about that map I showed a few slides ago and the priorities, this is the resistance had kind of determined amongst themselves their regions based on provinces and so forth. And then every one of these M2 or B2 or R3 ideally had an active FFI leadership, or what they call a military delegate, in place and ready to rock and roll when Overlord began. But like I said, in early May, a lot of these guys are arrested, constantly on the run. They can't transmit from the same place more than once. So just surviving is a chore. Now you can imagine surviving and then preparing to receive your orders at any minute and execute is a whole nother level of activity. And so the SOE had long thought that, when the activity spikes, the communications are just naturally going to go up, which means more and more are going to get arrested. So the purpose of the Jedburghs then was, after they were all arrested, originally, the purpose of the Jedburgh was, we assume that all these guys are going to get arrested, and we want leadership with radios plugged into active, effective resistance movements. And so the Jedburghs are kind of a strategic reserve for the leadership that the French and the British have on the ground at the time. Next slide. So D-Day begins, and this is a map that's helpfully available on the West Point History Department websites. They have wonderful maps there, and dozens and dozens of the Second World War. The targets that that are chosen by the beaches and so forth that are beyond the scope of this talk. But the Jedburghs, they're on an exercise. They're back in central England on an exercise, and they hear over the news that Overlord is on, and they are ticked off. These are all these young commandos. They thought they'd be in all before Overlord began. And so here it is, June 6th. They're out on a field problem doing an exercise, and a French Jedburgh I spoke to said we were some angry, especially the Frenchmen who volunteered to go first in. These were guys who were just into it, and they were going to be the first in, and they volunteered so that they could be the first in, and now they weren't, and really ticked off. There were 2 teams, 3 teams, depending on how you slice the dates, 4 teams maybe that were picked to go in. Weather delays and so forth on the 5th caused some problems. Team Ian winds up being the first team in country, and they wind up going to central France, which happens to be where Eugene Deschalette was operating. And so if you go to the next slide, I think I've queued that up. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, on D-Day, General Koenig sends this message out. The mission of all the armed forces of the interior is to fight. And that's what he tells them in an uncoded BBC blast. Well, they all take that to mean, okay, game on. I'm picking my targets and I'm attacking because the boss has told us so. That's not what they meant. The assumption, there's a few assumptions that go badly with D-Day, and one of them is without this, the assumption is that resistance really wasn't going to do much. That we were going to have to inspire them, that the SOE, the OSS people in France were going to have to inspire, lead, push, cajole, order to the extent that they could, the resistance to do something. But when the resistance finds out that D-Day is happening and they see this or they hear this, there's a lot of young men with guns and ammo that they are ready to use. And so the chaos starts. Next slide. On the 10th of June, Eisenhower asked Koenig, hey, it's getting out of hand. They're attacking targets everywhere throughout France. You have to issue a categorical order to tell them to knock it off, basically is what Eisenhower tells Koenig. So Koenig sends this coded to all of his regional military delegates and any Jedburghs if they were in country. He's basically saying currently it's impossible to predict the normal supply of weapons and ammunition. Limit to a simmer all of your guerrilla action. When possible, break contact everywhere while waiting for the phase of reorganization. This is a formal order. I'm telling you, knock it off, and you'll be given your resistance unit via your military delegate will be given precise orders of a bridge to hit or a movement to attack or something like that. Don't waste your ammo on all that stuff. Eisenhower is worried about 2 things. One is the operational wastage of all the supplies. The other thing he's worried about is what happens at Oradour-sur-Glane and other places that Germans get attacked and then they go into a village and they just kill everybody. And Eisenhower is very well aware that this is the kind of things that the Nazis will do, that the Wehrmacht would do. And so he's trying to keep all this, keep this regularized. And here's the kind of the fundamental key that I appreciated as a former regular serving officer in a unit that had the mission of unconventional warfare, is that guerrilla warfare is a method that a nation may choose to use. But of course, it's often a method that a group will choose to use because they don't have a legal formed government, right? Mm-hmm. So they're automatically guerrillas. The United States, Britain, and to some degree France is choosing to use guerrilla warfare as a method of war. But Eisenhower is concerned about the legal ramifications of not only atrocities happening, but the Germans then playing on civilians, shooting up targets. And they have, in German army regulations and law and practice, they have every right to just shoot on sight somebody with a gun or somebody with, incriminating information, explosives or that kind of thing. And so Eisenhower he's concerned he's not going to have enough of these guys. Then when they start hitting all these targets all over France willy-nilly, he's concerned about, well, they're going to shoot off all their ammunition and they're not going to be there when they need them. And he's also concerned about the implications of atrocities and what that would mean for everybody involved. So next slide. So Giles is a team in Brittany led by American Captain Bernard Knox. He's a particularly fascinating individual. He goes on to lead a long life as a scholar of ancient Greece and classics in the United States. He had been in the Spanish Civil War, been wounded. He grew up in England. He was a Brit and becomes an American because he marries an American in Paris in the 30s. Goes to make his way in the world in the United States with her. And then when World War II starts, he ultimately joins the American Army. And his French skills are so impressive. And his desire to get in the mix so strong that he winds up in the Jedburghs. He parachutes into Brittany in late June. And this is the message that he sends. He's constantly being told by headquarters that's now trying to keep up with the war, right? Because of the Koenig and the politics and all this, the French headquarters or the French command of Special Forces headquarters is constantly behind on the reality of the operational effort in France. And you can tell the messages they send just aren't meshing with reality at all. And finally, Captain Knox sends this to them. And I thought when I read this is a captain telling colonels and generals, you're not answering my questions. We're not thinking of our own skins, right? And here, we repeat in words of one syllable because you're morons. He's implying, how stupid are you? Listen to me. I have to tell you, if the Boche, which is the nickname for the Germans, attacks the maquis in this area, I can't hold them back. An American officer isn't going to be able to hold these guys back. You will have the powder keg and it's going to blow. And so he's lost all patience now. He's running all over Brittany, trying to keep his team alive, which he does, successfully does. He's got friends dead. A very good friend of his gets killed, I think, the day after that as commander of another Jedburgh team. And he's just having a heck of a time. And so he's basically saying, give us the order, please, because it's going to happen. Just tell us, because then we can make it all nice and legal. So ultimately, he'll get the order on the 3rd of August. Koenig will tell them all, okay. Because the 1st of August, 3rd Army enters Normandy. Patton is unleashed. And now it's time to make Brittany an area of emphasis. And so on the 3rd of August, all the teams in Brittany get the go order.
Which is an amazing story in and of itself. And one day we'll do a whole series of stuff about the massive great battles. I've been down to that part of France, and the sheer numbers of resistance that take up arms and do proper, like movie style ground combat against the Germans is extraordinary. And at the root of it are the Jed teams, which is amazing.
Yeah. Not too long ago, it might have been on your channel, on YouTube, I saw Giles calls in an airstrike. And an RAF, a couple of planes come in and take out Germans that have lodged themselves in a castle in Brittany. They just strafe the heck out of it. And he radios back, "Great job! That was really great." Well, it's that strafing run is on YouTube now, which I wish I had seen that before I wrote the book.
Wow! Yeah, how amazing!
Excellent.
Yeah.
So here's another thing that Eisenhower is concerned about, and I think when I read this message, Brits and Americans can be bad guys too, unfortunately. This is a message from I forget which team now. He's basically calling Team Andy. Yeah, this is led by an American. The Germans are mutilating and killing our wounded with kicked rifle butts and so forth. we are executing an equal number of prisoners. And he asks his higher headquarters, have this broadcast on the BBC so the Germans know that we're doing this. Now think about that. They're committing war crimes, and they want the Germans to know this. It's getting nasty. It's getting real nasty. And the French officers, it's not Team Andy. Actually, that's circled with a question mark on there because it's misattributed to another team because the radio code books and crystals have been switched up. This is another victim of the lack of being able to have enough time to plan on this. They attribute this message to the wrong team. And so their first reaction to this is, who is this really? Because this doesn't make any sense. You know, they're not worried about the mutilating and killing and the war crimes going on. They're trying to figure out which team really sent this. And we got to figure out the code books. So it's kind of an operational, organizational issue that gets the attention. Next slide. Here's the other kind of the leading up to the biggest kind of understanding that I had about what the Jedburghs did in the war, kind of at the big picture, was when Patton begins to break out, and you see there the red lines and that reach east. Patton is often credited for kind of throwing caution to the wind and racing out as far east as he can get, and not appreciating the fact that he could be outflanked. And if you watch the movie Patton, they kind of talk about that a little bit. Yep. Patton, of course, has got access to the ultra decrypts. And Patton has an element in his Third Army headquarters, a Special Forces staff element, that's telling him exactly where the Germans are, according to the resistance that are behind the lines. Patton also knows, and particularly once the southern invasion happens on the 15th of August with Dragoon, Patton knows that Hitler has ordered all the German forces not engaged in combat. So the ones around Bordeaux, if you're the Feldgendarmerie, or you're an anti-aircraft unit, or your police force, or your civilian official, you need to get back to Germany right now. So Patton knows this is not, he doesn't have to worry about being outflanked. He has to worry about closing the door. And between Patton and Patch coming up from the south, which I think is the next map, now the game, skip ahead. I'll keep the flow going here on and then these are the teams, the color-coded teams that are in France by the 1st of August. And you see this kind of mix of Jedburghs, special missions, OSS, SAS teams, and so forth, and in there. And then the next slide. Let's see if I can get to that.
Well, the one we just, that one that will go on again.
No, the map from
that one.
This one. So General Patch is leading primarily American, but some French forces in the invasion from the southern France. And when Hitler has a flash of common sense and says, okay, all the Germans get back to Germany, they're going to have to exit France through that window between Patton and Patch, which gets narrower every day. And so the Jedburghs in, again, Eugene Deschalettes' area, Hugh, Ian, and Andy to some degree, and a few other Jed teams are kind of operating in central France. Just, I should have put the mark on the map there. This is kind of south of where the A and the N is.
Right.
There's a huge, relatively large movement of relatively organized Germans fleeing, led by Major General Elster. They're getting ambushed intermittently on their way through. They're trying to maintain a sense of knowing where the gap is going to be, how they can avoid Patch or Patton to get back into Germany, and stay one step ahead of the French resistance. The Jedburgh teams, there's a number of them that are kind of trying to organize attacks and operations with the resistance in order to harass these guys or stop them or slow them down or cut them off. this leads to airdrops and a lot of things like that, to try and get them more weapons in order to close them off. There's a lot of radio traffic about, hey, we've got this golden opportunity. And then an intelligence officer and a lieutenant colonel come down from the conventional forces that are kind of on that southern edge of Patton's forces, meets up with General Elster, and the conventional forces American officer completely blows the opportunity. He takes them, he captures them, takes them back, but he treats them with all these honors and so forth that, you know, almost like a Union Confederate, you know, two guys who went to West Point together would do. The resistance is just furious about this. These guys have been, you know, doing whatever they wanted for 3 years in our country, and you're just giving them cigars and field rations. We've been starving. You know, we don't have oranges. Now they've got oranges. This is obscene what's happening to these guys. So the Elster surrender, I go into great detail in the book. And I think that's where, had the politics come together even a month earlier, Elster would have been arrested. His 18,000 or his 12,000 Germans captured easily by the resistance. Proper attribution to the resistance would have been given at the time. I looked in the newspapers. It was reported at the time in American newspapers and British newspapers that Elster surrendered, but all the credit was given to the conventional forces. Now, if you're worried about intelligence and security, you think, well, that's great because we don't want anybody to know anything about the Jedburghs. But the resistance was upset.
Yeah. It's a good time then to ask this couple of questions. So Gary is asking about how much does Ben think the Jeds were a political stroke diplomatic asset in comparison to a military asset? Because what you're saying there, they're almost doing the job of sort of parachuting in diplomats. You know, because so do you think they are in some ways as much as important in that area as they are in kind of organizing actual armed resistance?
Yeah, they are. In fact, the actual political control of France is, if there's a French military delegate still alive, he's in charge, and the Jeds recognize that. Yeah. Usually, sometimes there's a misunderstanding, but they get told by radio message, no, he's the boss. You need to pay attention to what he's saying. And I think that is a way for France to exercise sovereignty. And it's very important. De Gaulle at this time, and by August, he'll become famous for finding an SOE agent and kicking him out of the country. But he doesn't kick the British who are on Jedburgh teams out of the country because they're under Koenig's control.
So, I mean, we see that even in Normandy after invasion, when they set up the sort of civil affairs departments, there's a real effort to make sure that the French are seeing French involvement in this. It's not just American officers and British officers. They're really trying hard to kind of, you know, begin a transition towards a future where France will be self-governing again, even though the capital at this point has not yet been liberated. Half of France has still not been liberated. You see that political power behind the scenes that is going on. It's as much about thinking about the future. I mean, Churchill is famously already thinking about the Cold War by the summer of 44. And it's an important part to ask. We're going to go down that rabbit hole too much. But Stephen's asked a good question. You're talking about the fact there's lots of other things going on. So, you know, come August 44, how much pull did the Jeds have in terms of getting support for operations? Because you've got Dragoon being planned and happening. You've got SAS missions. You've got all sorts of actual proper ground parachute assaults, airborne assaults between June and September that didn't happen, but were planned. So where are they on the league table, so to speak?
Yeah, unfortunately, the message traffic is filled with them complaining about not getting enough air support. You were supposed to drop here today. It didn't happen. What's going on? Well, just as the question implied, the SAS has their own air support. Yeah. So when the SAS needs something, they get it. In fact, there'll be teams that collaborate. Koenig changes the game a little bit and sends Jedburgh teams with SAS teams, which in some cases, on the first day, SAS team Bullbasket lands with team Hugh. Hugh and Bullbasket have both agreed mutually, once they collect themselves on the ground and gather up all their gear, they say, you go your way, we're going to go ours. You know, we didn't train to work together. And you can't collaborate and train resistance people while we're also trying to conduct military operations, kick the teeth into the enemy. Those are mutually exclusive goals. So the British captain who's running Team Hugh recognizes that, and the SAS team goes their own way.
And the SAS, it's fair to say, by 44 have become a very different organization than the exciting early days of 41, 42 in the desert. They've become an official regiment with its own kind of structure. Whereas at the beginning, I was going to ask you this at the beginning, when Churchill sets up all these kind of butcher and bolt ideas, it's like a free for all. Everybody's got an idea, takes it to London, they get their own little special forces of ex countrymen, whatever it would be. But by 44, the Allies are saying, yeah, enough now, lads. Bring it all in, rein it all in. Let's start organize this on military lines. So the Jeds are kind of like a new. They're now.
Yes, yeah.
They're like they're the new boys, but they're trying to kind of set themselves up alongside people who've now been doing this for a couple of years. So I can see the real frustrations of this.
Yeah, and they will. The Jeds recognize immediately that when they get a bunch of resistance guys that stand out in the trees next to a field at 2 a.m, and they've told them, okay, the arms are going to be dropped here, and it doesn't happen, they lose their credibility.
Yeah.
And so they become very wary of setting things up, getting a reception team out there, wasting everybody's time, threatening with arrest and all that stuff from enemy activity, and nothing happens. And everybody walks away with no guns, no ammo, no cash. It's a real problem, particularly in the East, which I think might be, if you track back, we'll show that picture of Eisenhower standing with this guy. Yes.
There we go. Yeah.
So Paris is liberated. The guns activity starts about the 21st of August. The German commander decides it's an open city. He's not going to resist. There had been a coup attempt, which also I go into in the book, and how that impacts German military thinking and planning and so forth. It changes the dynamic within the German senior leadership in France tremendously after the coup attempt fails, and people start arresting one another, and then 2 days later they're coming out of jail and arresting the guy who arrested them. It's just a mess, and kind of in all of that, I think the German commander in Paris says, "Okay, we're not going to put Paris into rubble. It's an open city." And so the resistance is kind of ready to go. There were some Jedburgh teams that infiltrated into Paris as a part of the liberation. But the photograph is snapped after the city is cleared and liberated again. And this is Eisenhower there standing with Koenig. Koenig is given yet another hat. De Gaulle makes him the military commander of Paris. And I think Eisenhower is smiling so broadly because that was a job that Roosevelt was telling him that Eisenhower was going to do, and so now he doesn't have to do it. He's got a Frenchman. He's going to run Paris. He can run the war. He's certainly going to have to play Allied politics, but he can concentrate on what a military man is going to do. He doesn't have to worry about collecting the garbage and getting schools going and all this kind of stuff that the city needs. So that's going to be Koenig's challenge, running Paris. Next slide. Yeah. Here's another illustration of a Jedburgh team. Alistair radioing in. No mention of Sarko, which was an agent they were supposed to link up to. If you did not intend to give us any support, why do you send us here? There's no Americans here, so we can get no arms at all. For God's sake, do something. This is another kind of note like Captain Giles or Captain Knox from Team Giles sent. And that's dated, 5 September. So in late August, the senior leadership of the Jedburghs, Koenig is in France by that time. He's kind of more concerned with governing liberated France and liberated Paris. There's an American two-star that's now kind of running operations of the Jedburghs and special forces and so forth. He is trying to keep things flowing and so forth. And they decide, okay, we've got all these Jedburgh teams still in the reserves. Let's just throw them all in. So they decide that in early to mid-August. Weather goes bad. Then they lose aircraft capacity for what becomes Market Garden in early September. Finally, in just after that's over and mid-September, they've got the capacity and they just start throwing Jedburgh teams in. And so this is one of those teams that's kind of thrown in, and we can't get any guns. Why did you send this? This is a complete waste. And then the next slide is probably my favorite in futility. This is the battle lines as things get patch and Patton meet 7th of September, 8th of September. There's a couple of Jedburgh teams negotiating, those two main forces meeting. And then they start the push to the east. And in the forests of eastern France, southern Belgium, and southern or Luxembourg there's just tons of confusion going on. SAS teams are poured in also. And the Germans, of course, that they're facing here are mainline, mobile, not well equipped, but I mean, well trained, usually German forces. They're not the Feldjarmerie that you might find in southern France. These are dudes that have been fighting since D-Day, and now they're in engagement. So the Jedburghs, the nature of the war in this part of France at this time in the war is pretty fierce for the Jedburgh teams, because if they can't get drops, they can't get arms. It is a complete waste of time, and a lot of them are arrested. Here's that example of that. The last line. Some of it's kind of blurred out, by the way. The mimeograph copied it, and this is a photograph from the archives I took. You probably don't realize, but we were overrun. This area was overrun by the Allies before we arrived. We have done nothing at all. Funny war. This was sent from Team Henry. Yeah. So they were parachuted into an area that was liberated.
You win some, you lose some, I guess.
Yep. Next slide.
And it's just your book cover. So, well, thank you very much. Absolutely amazing. So the $1 million question is, was it effective on balance? What's the verdict?
I think, when you think about the clandestine war broadly, the code breaking, the special forces, the demolition, the sabotage, and so forth that went on, clearly it's when the United States Navy breaks the Japanese codes and we're able to prevail at Midway, it's not on that scale. It doesn't mean that for the war. I think the question about more politics than military thing, that is a real impact and a positive one for the Allies, that Eisenhower doesn't have to commit MPs or infantry to, run-of-the-mill French village security, that the French resistance have that. They're going to start elections. They start elections in liberated areas in September, October at local levels and so forth, and they're going to have a national election. In early October, Roosevelt finally comes around and recognizes de Gaulle. So I think all of that is an impact at the political level for French sovereignty. That's a positive one for the conduct of the war, but it's not necessarily one that has to do with, bullets and bombs. And
I think that's kind of the broad conclusion we get to a lot of these type things, is that some of the most, look, even some of the big military raid, look at the Doolittle raid or the British Dambusters raid. How much did they bring an end to the war? Not very much. What effect did they have? Peripheral, huge. You can't, and I think, we go back to what I was saying at the beginning about the need for the second front to not fail. And the number of people that were involved in SOE, OSS, the Jedburgh teams, you add them all together, the SAS missions, it's probably not even going to amount to half an infantry division. So it's not like, it's probably costing a lot of money, and there's a lot of people, a lot of meetings about it. But even if they only give you a very slight advantage on the battlefield, if they only just help smooth things out a little bit, it's got to be a card worth playing.
Yeah. Even with all the confusion, I think, domestic morale is vital for conducting a war.
Yeah.
Whether you're a king or a dictator or a prime minister or a president, you have to have that. So if you're going to reorganize and unite a post-war France. This is key for that.
Yeah, I mean, Terry just said that, did these groups pin down German troops in any numbers or disrupt German communications?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, there's sporadic instances of that.
I mean, when you look, sorry, to interrupt you, when you look at the transportation plan, we've done a couple of shows on our channel about how much effort was put bombing bridges that the Germans promptly rebuilt by the time they needed to cross them. Because that, if the Jeds went in too late, the transportation plan was probably started too early. And that was a massive investment of aircraft and personnel and bombs and time that can be elsewhere. So you could, if you can question the results of that as having much effect on the German reinforcements coming to Normandy, this definitely has stuff. I mean, we know the second SS Panzer Division Das Reich, they were delayed by the resistance. They were delayed by this, that, the other SAS missions into the Limoges area. Yes, it resulted in the death of all those people in that Oradour-Seglan because the SS got all angry about it. But that division arrived in Normandy later than they could have done, and that's something you can look at a lot of the Germans that arrived there.
Right. But that's not something the Jedburghs did.
Not the Jedburghs are doing, but
the resistance did the SS. But
it's part of
way. Yeah.
But part of the package, isn't it? It's all part of the same broad concept.
Yes, broadly, that's right.
Broadly. So there we are. So I think it's been absolutely well. I've enjoyed it, and I've learned more about this than I thought. I mean, I had read the book a few years ago, but you put it all together in a really good way. So yeah, I think people are going away, as always, having another little piece of the liberation of France puzzle put in the jigsaw, which is really good. So just to finish off, what are you working on next? Where's your work taking you to these days?
Well, so I did this a number of years ago, and kind of in response to what a boss had asked me to do, and now my boss has asked me to do something else. So I'm writing a history of the state of South Dakota in my present capacity as the state historian of South Dakota. The last one was done 3 decades ago, depending on which version you look at. So it's a serious need for updating. So that's where I'm working.
That's good. But just one last question. Mark Stanton asked, how many of the Jed teams were killed?
Well, surprising low number. So in the book, I have the ones who perished in combat are listed. I think the percentages was a lot lower than what they thought due to luck and kind of the fact that most of them were delayed in getting in. Team Augustus is wiped out. Team Jacob is nearly destroyed. Team Alec is, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 17 KIA out of 290 some who deploy in. So when Bernard Knox goes to get his parachute and his supplies out at the supply before he goes on the mission, he's told he doesn't need to sign the paperwork for it because the supply guy says you're never coming back.
Wow.
That's the kind of, they all just kind of think they're on a suicide. Many of them think they're on a suicide mission. Yeah.
So in that regards, it was not terribly costly. So well, yeah, brilliant stuff. So Ben, it's been a delight talking to you, and yeah, I'll be going away thinking about some of the things you raised and the French politics and afterwards, and it's been brilliant. So folks, as you know, go and buy the book. I'll hold up my copy again, links below, and then as always, click like and subscribe. Tell your friends what's going on here on World War II. We had a few new viewers tonight, which is nice. But I will see you after the weekend. Good luck, everybody. I will see you on Monday. Cheers. Thanks. Bye.